you probably know that Lalibela exists. You may have seen the photographs, the cross-shaped pit, the church carved into the earth, the Ethiopian pilgrims in white wrapping cloth crowded around the entrance. It tends to show up in lists. Greatest ancient monuments, wonders of the African world, proof that history's most extraordinary things happened everywhere, not just in the places we were taught to look. And all of that is true. But that's only part of the story. Because what those lists almost never tell you is that Lalibela is not simply a remarkable archaeological site. It is an 800-year-old question about faith, power, and the specific kind of human ambition that looks at a mountain and decides the most honest thing to do is carve it into a church. Tell me where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. I'm always curious who finds these stories, and where in the world someone is sitting when they encounter something like this for the first time. To understand what was built at Lalibela, you first need to understand the world in which it was built. It is the 12th century. Ethiopia is a Christian kingdom, has been officially Christian since the 4th century AD, which is earlier than most of Europe converted. The Zagwe Dynasty rules from the highlands of what is now the Amhara region. They are not a peripheral power or a remote footnote. They govern a significant and ancient civilization with a sophisticated court, a written language in Ge'ez, a theological tradition as deep as anything in Rome or Constantinople, and a sense of their own importance in the Christian world that is entirely justified. The Zagwe rulers are not trying to catch up with Europe. They do not know they are supposed to feel provincial. They are the heirs of a kingdom that received Christianity before the barbarians who would eventually become the English had even heard of it. And yet the world around them is shifting in ways that matter to any serious Christian king in this period. Jerusalem, the actual Jerusalem, the physical city that is the center of the entire Christian theological imagination, is contested. The Crusades are underway. Access to the holy sites is complicated, dangerous, expensive, and politically fraught. For Ethiopian Christians who had been making pilgrimage to Jerusalem for centuries, the question of how to maintain connection to the sacred geography of their faith is not abstract. It is urgent. Into this moment comes a man named Gebra Meskel. He is a prince of the Zagwe Dynasty. According to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, he is born surrounded by a swarm of bees, which in the old Ago language signifies sovereignty. And so he is called Lalibela. The bees recognize his kingship before his people do. He grows up in a court that is already built around theological ambition, already positioning itself as the guardian of one of the world's oldest Christian traditions. And by the time he becomes king, sometime around 1189, though the exact date is debated, he has a vision, not a metaphorical vision, a literal one according to the tradition. He is taken up to heaven, shown a city of churches built from solid rock, and told by God to go back and build it, to create a new Jerusalem in Ethiopia, to give his people a sacred city they could reach without crossing the contested lands of the Middle East. Whether you take that vision literally or understand it as the way a medieval Ethiopian king would narrate a policy decision, the result is the same. Lalibela begins building. The scale of what he commissions is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind. 11 churches, not built from stone, carved from it. The entire structure of each church, walls, windows, roof, columns, arches, interior chambers, decorative details, is a single continuous piece of the mountain. The mountain was cut away around and above each church to reveal it. The church was always there, in a sense. The builders removed everything that was not the church. Start with the largest one. Bete Medhan Alam, the house of the Savior of the world. It is roughly 12 meters tall, more than 28 meters long, and nearly 12 meters wide. It has 5 aisles separated by carved columns. It has a carved veranda running around 3 sides. It sits in a courtyard carved from the same rock, reached by a tunnel cut through the stone. The entire structure, every surface you can touch, every angle you can measure, is carved from one unbroken piece of volcanic basalt. There are no seams where pieces were joined. There are no blocks that were quarried elsewhere and transported. What was removed forever, in the form of chips and dust. What remained became the church. Every window frame is part of the same mountain as the floor it stands on. Every column is the same stone as the roof it holds up. This is not construction. It is subtraction. It is the most committed form of making that exists because you cannot add back what you take away. Every decision is permanent before you fully understand its consequences. And they did it with iron chisels. Here is where I want to slow down, because this is the part that tends to get skipped in the standard account. The Zagwe builders were not improvising. They were working within a rock-hewn tradition that was already centuries old in Ethiopia when Lalibela was born. The Tigray region to the north has more than 100 rock-hewn churches, some of them possibly 1,000 years older than Lalibela. The technique of carving downward from the surface, freeing a structure from the surrounding rock, managing drainage around the excavation, finishing interior surfaces to architectural precision, all of this existed as a practiced tradition before a single chisel touched the lasta basalt. What Lalibela brought was not the technique, it was the scale, the theological coherence, and the political will. Because building 11 churches of this complexity, organized as a deliberate New Jerusalem, named with the specific sacred geography of the original city. A river called the Jordan runs near the site, a hill named Calvary. Specific churches corresponding to specific Jerusalem holy places requires more than craft. It requires a vision of what the finished thing will mean, held consistent over what would have been decades of labor. That kind of sustained visions is a form of power as much as a form of faith. And Lalibela was exercising both simultaneously. The 11 churches are not 11 isolated objects, they are a landscape. They are connected by tunnels, trenches, and ceremonial passageways cut into the rock. Moving between them is a designed experience. You descend into the earth, move through stone corridors, emerge into open-air courtyards, descend again, arrive at a church interior that is simultaneously underground and fully formed. The experience of pilgrimage at Lalibela is not like walking through a museum. It is more like moving through a three-dimensional argument about the nature of sacred space. The northern group of 6 churches and the southeastern group of 5 are separated by a channel called the River Jordan. On the western edge, slightly apart from both groups, Bete Georgis stands alone in its square pit, the Church of St. George, the patron saint of Ethiopia, the last church built according to tradition, and perhaps the most perfectly resolved architecturally. It is a cross plan carved into a cross-shaped pit, with a cross pattern carved in relief on its roof. It is the church that appears most frequently in photographs and that most reliably stops people who see it for the first time. But I want to talk about Bete Golgotha for a moment, because it is the least visited and in some ways the most significant. Bete Golgotha, the House of Calvary, is in the northern group, connected to Bete Mikael through a shared vestibule called the Selassie Chapel. Its interior contains carved relief figures of saints, some of the finest medieval carved figures in Africa, and according to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, it contains the tomb of Lalibela himself. He is buried, if the tradition is correct, in the church named after the hill where Christ was crucified. In the place he named after the place of the defining death of the religion, he dedicated his life and his kingdom and his mountain to serving. There is something in that, a king who built a new Jerusalem and chose to spend eternity in the part of it named for Calvary, that feels less like triumphalism and more like a statement about the kind of faith he actually had. Not the faith that expects reward, the faith that understands what it is asking of itself. The construction of the churches is one story. What happened to them over 800 years is another one entirely, and it is still ongoing. The site has never been abandoned. This is the crucial fact about Lalibela that separates it from almost every other monument of comparable age and ambition. The Egyptian temples were abandoned. The Mayan cities were swallowed by jungle. Machu Picchu was quietly vacated and not officially rediscovered for 4 centuries. Lalibela has been in continuous daily use since the day the last church was finished. Priests have lived there for 8 centuries. The liturgy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the ancient Ys language, the same language in which it was first written down, has been sung in these carved stone interiors without interruption across 800 years of Ethiopian history. Wars, famines, changes of dynasty, foreign invasions, the rise and fall of empires. The priests were there through all of it. The churches were used through all of it. This continuous use is both the greatest evidence of Lalibela's meaning and the source of its greatest preservation challenge. The rock from which the churches were carved is soft volcanic basalt. It is workable, which is what made the original construction possible. But it is also susceptible to water damage, and the seasonal rains of the Ethiopian highlands have been slowly eroding the carved surfaces for 800 years. By the late 20th century, the situation had become serious enough that UNESCO, which inscribed the site as a World Heritage Site in 1978, took action. In 2008, they installed large metal shelter structures over several of the churches to protect the carved surfaces from direct rainfall. The shelters work. They are protecting the stone. They are also, depending on your perspective, either a reasonable conservation necessity or an aesthetic catastrophe that imposes industrial metal structures on one of the most beautiful ancient sites on Earth. The debate is genuine and it has not been resolved. Ethiopian heritage officials, international conservation experts, architects, and the priests who have been at this site longer than any of the organizations debating above them have all weighed in. There is no clean answer. There rarely is when the thing you are trying to preserve is also the thing you are trying to use and protect and keep alive and visit and make accessible and hand to the next generation in better condition than you received it. Every January, for the celebration of Jenna, Ethiopian Christmas, the population of Lalibela multiplies many times over. Pilgrims come from across Ethiopia and from the Ethiopian diaspora around the world. The churches are not large enough to contain the crowds. People gather in the trenches, in the courtyards, on the rock faces above. The white of the traditional prayer shawl, the netela, fills every space. The chanting of the deacons in Giez echoes off the carved stone walls the same way it has echoed off those walls for 8 centuries. I want to be careful here because it is easy to make this sound like a scene from a documentary, which is what it is, and to miss what it actually represents. What is happening at Jenna in Lalibela is not a reenactment of something. It is not a preservation of something. It is the thing itself, still happening. The religion that Lalibela built for is still the religion of the people who gather there. The language the liturgy is sung in is the language it was written in. The theological tradition that gave this place meaning has not been replaced by another tradition that decided to preserve it as a monument to the first one. This is genuinely rare. And it changes what the site is. Lalibela is not primarily a historical site that happens to still be used. It is primarily a living religious center that happens to be historically extraordinary. That ordering matters. It matters in how conservation decisions are made. It matters in how visitors behave. It matters in how the Ethiopian Orthodox Church understands its relationship to the site versus how UNESCO understands its relationship to the site. These are not always compatible understandings, and the tension between them is ongoing. And then there is the question that the official history cannot answer, because the evidence simply does not exist. Who were the people who actually did the carving? The tradition says angels helped, that the construction that happened by day was matched or exceeded by what angels completed each night, which is how work of this scale was possible within a single king's reign. This is not an embarrassing claim to explain away. It is the tradition's honest way of saying, we cannot fully account for how this happened, and we are not going to pretend we can, which is in its own way more truthful than the confident calculations of modern researchers who project labor numbers from chisel marks and rock volume without any actual evidence about how the work was organized. What we can say is that there were people, many of them over many years, doing extremely skilled and extremely physical work, cutting basalt with iron tools, removing thousands of tons of rock from around structures that were simultaneously being revealed and being refined, making decisions about where to cut, how deep to go, how to manage the drainage, what to do when the rock quality changed unexpectedly, that required both technical expertise and aesthetic judgment in the same moment, and that could not be undone. Those people have no monument. They have the monument they made. But their names, their organization, their lives, their understanding of what they were making, that is gone. As it is gone for the workers of the Great Wall, and the pyramid builders, and the haulers of Stonehenge, and every other construction of this scale and ambition. The thing that survives is the work. The people who did the work are the invisible assumption on which the entire achievement rests. Lalibela died sometime around 1225. He was buried, tradition says, in Bete Golgotha, in the church he named for the place of the crucifixion. In the New Jerusalem he spent his reign building. The Zagwe Dynasty that he served was itself overthrown in 1270 by a ruler who claimed descent from the ancient Solomonic line, the lineage that traced itself back to the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba that Ethiopian tradition holds as the origin of its royal house. The Zagwe kings are not the dynasty that Ethiopian historiography has most honored over the centuries. They were, in a certain sense, written as a parenthesis between two Solomonic periods. And yet it is the Zagwe period that produced Lalibela. The parentheses is where the churches are. History does this sometimes. The official narrative runs in one direction, and the most lasting things happen in what was supposed to be the margin. Here is the question I keep coming back to. Lalibela, the king, the man who began his life being named after bees, looks at a mountain and decides to carve it into a sacred city. He is motivated by faith, certainly. He is also motivated by politics, the need to give his kingdom a Jerusalem of its own, to anchor his people's religious identity in a physical place they control. He is motivated by ambition, the kind of ambition that needs to be expressed at a scale that outlasts the person who felt it. All of those motivations are real, and none of them cancel each other out. This is what people are actually like, the ones who make things that last. And what he made has lasted. 800 years of daily use. 800 years of chanting in the same ancient language in the same carved stone interiors. 800 years of pilgrims walking the same trenches and tunnels and arriving in the same courtyards and feeling something that we can approximately but never exactly describe. The question is not whether it is remarkable. It obviously is. The question is what it means that a human being with iron tools and religious conviction and a political problem to solve could look at a mountain and see inside it something that the rest of us could not see until the mountain had been removed. What is that quality? Is it faith? Is it vision? Is it the particular kind of stubbornness that refuses to believe the world is only what it currently looks like? And if that quality exists, if it has been expressed in basalt in the Ethiopian highlands and is still there to be visited, what does it ask of the people who visit it? I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure there is one. What do you make of all this? Leave your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and come back. There are more of these waiting.